Okay, so to continue with this concept of connecting and the infrastructure, I'm now very pleased to invite Nikhil Kapur. He's the partner at Strive, venture capitalist. And Nikhil, we had a discussion previously about investing in the API infrastructure layer, but now you're going to share um, how the global infrastructure can be built from India. So it's very relevant for this conference. Very keen to learn from your perspective.
Thanks, John. Thanks, and great to talk to you again after a short period of time. Yeah, we'll dive straight ahead, like into the presentation. And today we are going to be talking about how companies and startups are building global dev and API infrastructure coming up from India. And there's a QR code on the slide here, so feel free to scan it and download the slides directly from our website. It's right there at the end of this presentation as well, so we'll leave it on for you guys, and hoping to get some interesting questions and hoping to excite you around this opportunity that's coming up in India. Next slide, please. Great. So there are three parts of this presentation, and today we are going to be talking about sort of the macro environment around developer infrastructure and API infrastructure. And then we'll talk a bit about the micro, which is what's really happening on the ground, bottom up in these markets, such as India, where these companies are building for the world, starting from India. And then the last bit, we will go into some of the challenges or where the future lies, at least from our perspective, and where we see some opportunities as well as areas that we need to strengthen. Next slide, please. Great. So if you look at cloud services globally, right, like it's no new news that cloud services are taking over all of the infrastructure as well as services economy, and there's almost $180 billion of cloud spend today that's happening across the world, and it's happening across all particular functions and departments in any company, all the way from a small little tiny traditional sort of business to a large scale enterprise, a Fortune 10 company, right? And this is sort of the spend as it has grown in the last 5-6 years. So it's a very, very recent, I would say, phenomena to spend on cloud services. And this is sort of the wave that a lot of global companies, such as the names at the bottom, are riding on, because there's so much of this shift of spend from either internal infrastructure or infrastructure that didn't even exist, and tools and solutioning that didn't exist so far in the market, right? And as you can see, probably the significant chunk of that spend goes into the R&D side, right? So it's the R&D department, your product people, your engineers, your IT, your DevOps, which ends up spending almost 30% of this cloud services spend, right? And the data is a bit dated. Unfortunately, there's not been a new report, I'm guessing partly due to the pandemic, but we can only guess where these things went during the pandemic, right? Like as more and more stuff started shifting to the API world, to the digital world, we saw like some amazing sort of growth rates shown by companies which are targeting this R&D infrastructure spend, right? So New Relic, Twilio, Datadog are all sitting at like, close to 130% net dollar retention numbers. This is the latest quarter numbers. So that means that even their existing customers are expanding by almost 30% year on year. And this is net of churn. So you can imagine most of the companies are probably expanding their spend 50% year on year on these products, right? And that's sort of the macro environment that we live in. Of course, there will be some headwinds from time to time, like where the public markets today are sort of, a bit softening, and that will lead to some softening of expenses and expenditure. But this cloud spend is not going to go away anytime soon. And this is sort of the opportunity that lies ahead for people who are building today in this market. Next slide, please. And so where does Asia come into this, right? Like the beauty that we are starting to see now in Asia is that the number of developers and the number of product people in this part of the world are far outstripping those that are existing in the US or even the Chinese market. So if you combine the number of developers across India and Southeast Asia, today it's already surpassed the number in the US. So it's crossed 13 million across Southeast Asia and India. And just between India and Indonesia, these two markets, we've already crossed China in terms of number of developers. And the growth rate also is much higher, much faster in these markets as we're adding more and more software developers and engineers into this ecosystem. So naturally, as the developer sort of base shifts into this part of the world, we are also seeing the spend starting to shift in this part of the world. So more and more of these companies like Twilio, New Relic, Datadog are setting up their APAC HQs and trying to target this market. And there's an opportunity for Asian companies to maybe be one step ahead of some of these global companies, as well as build over here and target the market sitting in the US market or Chinese market or European market. And so that's the sort of, I would say from a timing perspective, it's ripe for companies which are coming up from India specifically. Next slide, please. And moving on to what that means then for companies in India, right? Next slide, please. We are seeing some amazing growth of companies which are taking this path and transitioning towards a global market starting from India, right? I think the column on the left, like are the unicorns, the 8 out of 100 unicorns in India, which are targeting the infrastructure side of the economy, and a lot of them end up becoming are like API leaders in their own parts, and we'll discuss a few of these. But there's also, a spread of companies, unicorns in the communication space, like Uniphore and Gupshup. And, it's also very heartening to see MapMy India, which is a maps-focused sort of infrastructure play, going public last year on the Indian market. So not only is this trend starting to happen in the private markets, we are also seeing now the public markets accepting companies which are building for the world or for APAC from India. And this is sort of these are the 8 companies which are leading the charge and sort of generating excitement around this category. And all the people on the right hand side, they're trying to follow in the footsteps of these companies, right? And we have a number of companies which are sitting in both the growth stage as well as the very early stage of having just started maybe a couple of years ago and building for the world, but from India. Again, this spans across the breadth and universe of infrastructure companies, all the way from communication layer like 100ms to data infrastructure like Atlan, to test infrastructure like Lambda Test and Test Sigma, to authorization like super tokens, to no code internal tools like AppSmith and Tooljet, and many, many more, right? And by no means is funding the only proxy for the growth of companies, and we are starting to see even bootstrap companies such as Wingify do so well, building for the world from India in the infrastructure layer. And that is, again, like another very good sign that you can build a highly profitable, highly revenue generating business and do it out of these markets. Next slide, please. And one of the major shifts that have happened in the last few years is this I would say, the third phase of evolution in the GTM. So originally, the infrastructure companies or SaaS companies starting from India would leverage on sort of the, let's call it, the more economical sales capacity and sales bandwidth, apart from, of course, the engineering bandwidth, like this cheaper sales dollars spent per customer as sort of the go-to-market strategy. So you would throw sort of marketing dollars to attract like companies or customers to your website, and then you would have a slightly more economical sales bandwidth which can go and sell to these people, right? And so that was sort of the era of sales-led growth, where we saw companies such as Freshworks emerge. And then we started seeing a lot of product-led growth companies, right? And Wingify and Zoho, these folks basically said, like, as long as we build a market-leading product, people will find us and sort of come to us and will choose us over their peers. So we don't have to really sell to them. It can be more marketing and product-led growth that we can focus on. But in the last 2-3 years, we have seen this phenomena of community-led growth, right? Especially in the infrastructure side. And I think this is not news for anyone that developers don't like being sold to. So if you're building an infrastructure company, sales is probably not the way to go to market to a developer. Instead, like if you build a strong community of these developers, and a lot of times this community sits in the open source ecosystem, right? But you can even build communities outside, right? And if you take this community focused approach towards your marketing, towards your growth, then you tend to attract this developer base towards your product, towards your service. Then they discover you, then they compare you with other products in the market, and then they adopt in almost a self-serve fashion. And not only that, like as a community member, they tend to contribute back into your product in trying to improve your product. So it's a very healthy, virtuous cycle for your company. And we've seen that in these two unicorns across Postman and Hasura. And thankfully, we as a fund have been part of the Hasura journey. So we've seen it fairly inside out in that company. Next slide, please. And so talking about these two companies specifically and talking about community-led growth, on one hand, you have Postman, which is, I would say, a closed community, which is centered around API ecosystem and API management. And a lot of the community members, the 20 million developers which are using Postman today, they crossed that milestone in April of this year. So it's a very recent sort of phenomena. And these developers are contributing their own APIs back into the ecosystem for the other developers to use, reuse those APIs. So it's almost like starting to become an API marketplace. If you go to the website, you'll start seeing these kind of APIs being developed by other developers, but being launched on Postman platform. On the other hand, you have a company such as Hasura, which took a more open source route towards community development and built the whole product with an open core philosophy where the core is sort of open sourced. And there's almost 600 developers who are contributing extremely actively into the Hasura core without even being connected or being part of the company, just because they want to contribute to this open source sort of technology which can benefit others, right? And we are seeing an immense amount of developer activity, both in terms of contribution as well as downloads or Docker pulls of the GraphQL container, and extreme sort of developer love shown across by the 25,000 GitHub stars that the product has managed to receive. So very two different kinds of communities that these two companies have built, but leading to sort of the same end goal, which is to propagate the product as well as to get a virtuous cycle of feedback into the product. And yeah, this kind of a thing didn't used to exist a few years ago, but like only in the last 2-3 years, because of the globalization of this developer community and all of them sitting, interconnected on a GitHub or a Hacker News or a Reddit, like, they're able to sort of connect with each other and build together on these platforms. Next slide, please. And so talking a bit about the future, next slide, please. We feel there are three parts that we need to sort of focus on going ahead, right? Like, especially if we want to grow the developer infrastructure ecosystem from India, we need to focus on making sure that we are building and focusing our energies on mission critical infrastructure, because if your product is not mission critical and is not being used in a more mission critical way by your customer, you will not find the kind of adoption as well as monetization of your product, right? The second thing I feel that we need to focus on is around developing the talent in the right places. And the last thing is to build sort of an interconnected global ecosystem. So let's dive into each one of these. Next slide, please. So on mission critical infrastructure, right, like from at least Strive's perspective, these are the three areas that we are spending most of our time and energy on at this moment. It's across dev environments, which are, again, mission critical dev environments. How do we productionize a lot of the infrastructure and code that is being written by developers and make it easy for other developers to build on top of it? As well as how do we create things such as ephemeral environments for these developers to try and test and run their code bases and then sort of deploy it in production. And we are seeing this, in some good companies. These are not Indian companies, not all of them, by the way, but a lot of them are sort of open source companies and building globally. But these are some of the companies we ourselves are drawing inspiration from, because companies such as RunX are building overall dev environments, and Remix is doing it in the front end side, and Superbase is doing it in the backend layer and making it easy to expose a backend for developers. And so we are starting to see it across the stack within the whole dev environment ecosystem. And so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done across the stack, and these kind of companies are starting to fill the gaps. On the data access side, data is still funnily, after so much investment and so much adoption of tools and technologies in the data sphere, there's still a lot of challenges in terms of both ingesting and then analyzing and then sort of building on top of the data pipelines, right? So there's some interesting work going on by N8N, which is around more on the workflow automation using connecting data from one source to another destination. There's a lot of Airbyte work. Airbyte is doing a lot of work in more of the data streaming side and sort of creating the data pipelines. And then Hasura is doing a lot of work on the operational data layer. So on how to operationalize the data that you have sitting in your warehouses, sitting in your backends, and make, let's say, decisioning on it or expose it to your client side. So there's a lot of work which is happening again on the data access side, very mission critical, and we are spending a lot of time on this side. And then the last side is around ML ops, but also I would say the general ML infra side. Machine learning is fairly new as a technology. And even though it has been existing in more of the sciencey and data sciencey world for the last few years, we are only now starting to see machine learning models getting productionized. And as we try to productionize these environments, one of the bigger challenges is that data scientists and data engineers are not trained in running DevOps. And they haven't sort of, been brought up in that environment of seeing scale and seeing, their machine learning model being deployed in real world, right? So they've been doing it more in the labs, and now those same models are being thrown, on the real world, and they tend to break down very quickly. So there's a lot of infrastructure work that is being done on this side, and of course the large cloud companies such as AWS and Google are coming up with more of a platform end-to-end ML infra approach. But there's also a lot of point solutioning that needs to be solved within the infrastructure. And KubeDev is doing a lot of work on that side around metric store. Feast is doing it around feature store. And Amundsen is doing it around sort of the metadata side. So there's a lot of work again that needs to be done across the ML infrastructure. Next slide, please. And then I think on the second thing that we need to focus on is the talent development. And there's the open source talent that we still need to develop. India is still, while we are sitting at around 7 million developers in India, we're still one of the lowest in terms of contribution towards open source. And so there are communities such as Foster United who are trying to sort of excite some parts of this contribution. And there's also things that need to be done around the marketing side, right? And because this is another aspect of taking your product to the market once you come up with the right sort of product market fit goal. And then on the next slide, please. On the last aspect, I feel, given that we're building global infrastructure from India, and we're talking about doing that, like it's important to build the right sort of ecosystems around this also, to make sure that we are able to bridge corridors between India and US, India and the rest of APAC, India and Europe, hopefully. And API Days is a great initiative to do parts of this. And there's other initiatives that are happening right now. On the India-US corridor, a lot of venture firms, as well as some of the SaaS specific communities like SaaS Booming and SaaS Insider are trying to connect these ecosystems. And then within the India APAC segment, of course, there's venture firms like us and Surge, but also SaaS Talk is doing work to sort of bridge these ecosystems. And I hope that more and more such initiatives come up so that developers can work together. And we can even have dev-focused communities which are spread across these corridors. Yeah. Thanks. And I think that's where I would end. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
And we will hopefully let's build more. And here's the same QR which you can access to get access to the slides.
Thanks very much for sharing that, Nikhil. I guess what strikes me is when the cloud computing idea started and companies like AWS really commoditized infrastructure, and they were followed. Now you have choices with Azure and GCP as well. But that hasn't, even though each of those cloud computing platforms has a lot of modules, a lot of services that you can access, it hasn't killed the startup of making very specialized solutions to solve specific problems, and many of them open source. So you mentioned a number of open source firms, and a couple of our sponsors like Confluent is heavy born out of Kafka, DataStax born out of Cassandra, and they really built a business model around it. But it's still open source, and there's still a lot of contributors to that who are not actually connected to the company. I think that plays into a little bit about what you said about talent development and contributing to open source, because I think there are some companies that are more successful at fostering a community than others. They may be open source, but they end up being the ones who are driving that almost entirely, whereas other firms manage to get contributions from lots of developers who are not actually employees. So I guess there's aspects of how you encourage developers to contribute to open source as a part of their professional development, and also as part of building something, and maybe even learning to create their own open source communities.
Yeah, truly. Actually, one anecdote on that side would be when I was doing my engineering in India, our engineering ecosystem is built in such a way that you're great when you're entering, but you don't learn much like in the school itself, right? And so we would do like a lot of these side projects. And personally, I spent time working with Mozilla Foundation and did a lot of open source development over there. And that's sort of, taught me a lot about real world production dev environment, which the moment I went out from my college into Microsoft, I could apply a lot of that like instantly into sort of building something which was meaningful. So like that kind of activity needs to start happening at sort of the grassroots level. And our colleges are still a bit behind in sort of encouraging this sort of open source development and contribution right from when people are being taught about software development. And it's funny, like the world is open, you can go there, you can contribute, you can learn so much, but it's not yet being encouraged in the same level. So I'm hoping that changes over time, and we are trying to do some initiatives to do the same, and that will create sort of that talent pipeline for companies, because that's the biggest challenge that most companies face. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much for sharing those insights, Nikhil. Again, I can't believe 25 minutes went by so quickly, but with so much insight into the tech industry. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me again.